This is part two of our winter barn piece. And in today's class, we are going to talk all things painting the barn. So it's really fun to paint. We're going to talk about some different brush techniques that we can use. So let's just jump in and get started. The first thing that I'm going to do is glue down all of the pieces. So you can see I'm showing the glue here and showing that they're all glued in place. The big thing here is just making sure that the spacing is right. Use your tracer. I'm showing using the ruler over on this side. You really want to make sure that that side of the silo is perfectly vertical. So use a pencil, check your spacing, check everything before you start to glue. And then, of course, like I always warn you, anytime that you're gluing, before you start to paint, triple, quadruple check that glue is dry, because if you touch any of those areas with your paintbrush will be ruined. There will be nothing you can do to save it. So I'm coming back in with a paintbrush. This is a little bit of the sky mixture that I had left over from when I painted the sky in. And I'm just going around the edges, making sure that any pencil marks are covered, but also making sure that the sky is painted well right up to those edges. I want to make sure that no substrate is showing behind the pieces. It's a nice thing about saving your palette. You have some of those mixes still saved. I don't know if you can see my phone over to the side. I'm watching the laser while I'm painting. So I'm mixing the burnt sienna, and I believe that that's phthalo. Let me pull out my color mixes again. I'm mixing a gray that we are going to be using all through the painting of our barn. So I think here that blue is actually any of the blues would work. I know I used the cobalt blue in the sky, so I believe I might have used cobalt blue in this gray as well. But when you download the information, the PDF workbook for this class, make sure that as you're painting your piece, that you write down what you used, so that if you need to mix more gray and your palette dried up, you'll be able to remix those grays or something that's close. I'm going to start with just blocking in all of these door shapes. This is very, very loose. For this very dark mixture, I did add in some phthalo blue. So in our Facebook group, in our Patreon members Facebook group, I'll be posting a picture of my color mixes. It shows exactly how I mixed that black. If you've watched the limited palette video that I did, that talks about how I mix the black too. But they're just the green mix, quinacridone magenta, burnt sienna, with some of that phthalo blue, kind of all of the dark colors to make a very interesting black. It's just a little bit more interesting than an out of the tube black. But I am trying to make sure that the windows and doors have a little bit of interest. I'm not making them one solid color. I'm making them look as if the sun is shining in a little bit. Or this is the shadow side. So at least some light coming in. It's not just a blank black space back there. I'm going to come forward a little bit, be very loose here. In fact, as I'm painting this, I'm thinking that I'm probably going to come in and add more detail to it later. And I didn't end up needing to do that. I liked it just the way that it was. So this is more of a grade mixture. So just adding a little bit more of the titanium white. I'm running my brush along the bottom to give some shadow to that ground area beneath the barn. I really did like cobalt blue for this piece. Cobalt blue is not one of the blues that that I suggest for the limited palette. If you are looking to add a couple of colors, I always talk about Christmas. I love getting paint for Christmas. So Payne's Gray is a great color to add to your wish list. Cobalt blue, I love. And of course, Buff Titan, I love that color. But for skies, the cobalt blue can be a very nice blue to use. I'm going to come forward a little bit. I am using my favorite filberts here. You can see restating the very darks at the tops of all of the windows. Now I'm going to come in and start basing in the barn. And the big things to think about here are which side of the barn you're having as the side that the sun is hitting, or the highlight side, and which side is in shadow. For me, the left side of the barn, or the side with the 3 windows, that will be my shadow side. And this front area with the little milk shed and the large barn door, that will be the highlight side. So as I'm painting, I'm going to be constantly reminding myself that I want this front side to be warmer, and I want the shadow side to be cooler. So for me, as I'm painting, the warmer side will have more of the burnt sienna. The cooler side will have more of the blues. So I'm just following some of the engraved details. If you're not using the wood cutouts, hopefully you painted the entire background with the trees like we did in the last class. And then you could put your tracer on at this stage, trace the entire barn on, and paint it exactly the same way that I'm painting here. So I added in some of the darker areas right under the eaves. Now I'm coming in with more of a burnt sienna grade mixture. Like I said, remembering that this is the warm side. I want this first basin layer to have lots of variation, but I want to make sure that I'm making it dark enough that when I come back in with some of the weathered white that I'm going to put on the top, that this base layer is dark enough to show that. So it's going to look ugly for a while. You just kind of have to prepare yourself. And hopefully seeing the video like this um, will help you to be okay with the fact that it has an ugly duckling stage. Because this is the base layer, I'm purposefully thinking about my paint having no texture. So I I don't want there to be ridges of paint from my brush strokes. You can see me remixing some of the gray, so adding the burnt sienna with the blue to get the gray color, and then a little bit more burnt sienna to warm it up. But my paint mixture, if you'll look over on the palette, my paint mixture is very mottled. It's not thoroughly mixed to just one color. And I paint like that a lot. I don't very often pre-mix a pile of color. I like to go over and just continually mix and change my colors a little bit as I add color to my brush. Adding a little bit of a darker area right along this sort of horizontal board that is over the barn door. I wanted that shadow along the right side of the roof line to be a little bit more pronounced, almost as if the sun is over on the right side, but um, a little bit more to the side of the barn. Excuse me. So that eave of the roof would hang over and create a bit more of a shadow on the right side where our light source is coming from. You can see the vertical strokes of the paintbrush. That helps to get some of the feel of those vertical boards going along there. The direction of our brush strokes matters a lot, even in this very beginning stage of just blocking in the color. I like how the burnt sienna shadows on that left side looked. Again, going back to what we were talking about before, if the sun was catching a little bit more of that side of the front of the barn, it would be a little bit warmer. You can really, it really impacts the final piece when you are constantly thinking about those kinds of things. How would the sunlight affect it? Where are the warmer colors? Where are the cooler areas? And bringing in just a few more strokes of those dark colors. Again, very vertical sweeping strokes. Not so much trying to add detail here as just give the impression of the boards and make sure it's dark enough that my next layer will show up well. So you saw me pinch wipe the brush off. Now I'm going back over some of those strokes that I made and just settling them in a little bit. By brushing over them with the clean brush, I can make them not such fine lines, but push them into that paint behind them a little bit. All of this is going to be covered. And if looking at this, I'm already like right at about 30 minutes in of just painting this part. But all of the strokes that I'm making are helping me feel my way, decide what I like. I don't like to hurry. So I never worry about if a layer is going to be covered later. So now I'm just adding in that very dark edge underneath of the eave of the roof on that side. Quin magenta, some of the phthalo, some of the burnt sienna to mix that very dark color. I'm going to come forward just a little bit. Doing this bottom edge of the barn is going to be exactly the same way. You can see how warm that color looks at the bottom. I darkened it again at the roof line just a little bit. Painting over at the milk shed the very same way. I did go ahead and put a little bit of a shadow at the base of the walls. You can see how it's a little bit darker at the bottom of the front of the barn. So now I've mixed some gray for this side of the barn. You can see that I'm already thinking about cooler. That first stroke that I made, I felt like it was a little too blue, so I came back in and added a little bit more of the burnt sienna and darkened it a little to go underneath of this edge of the roof. So every time I mix paint, like you see me mixing here on the palette camera, this is a fairly new mixture that I'm building over here. So as I take the brush over to my piece, I'll take a stroke or two, and I'm thinking right then, is that the color that I want? If it's not, go back to your palette and mix a little bit more. But always be thinking about it when you take your brush over to your piece, take that first stroke of the brush. It's going to look different on your piece than it looks over on your palette, just because of the greens that are over there, the blues that are in the sky. All of those other colors make the color look different when it gets on your piece. So test it out, try a couple of strokes, and go back to your palette and adjust it if you need to. So I hope you can see already in just what's building up on this left side of the barn. You can already pick out the cooler blues that are over there. But you can also see the variation of color. It's not one flat bluish gray. I'm letting the colors be modeled and have variation. You see me dipping into the airbrush medium at the top. I use that to thin my paints, particularly on the base end like this. I want my paints to flow a little bit, be a little bit thinner. If you were having trouble with your paint drying or dragging too much, you could certainly use the liquid extender. I always have those two containers open, the airbrush medium and a liquid extender. The liquid extender also helps me manage my palette. So some of these places where I'm mixing these colors, if I just dip the tip of my brush into the airbrush medium as I dip back into those colors, it will help me keep those mixtures wet so that I can keep working with them. So if I reach over to my palette and I feel like my paint is thickening or drying too much, then I will definitely dip into the extender. So it's just, I'm always thinking about managing my palette as well as managing the painting. You could see me there concentrating a little bit on that corner of the barn. I want to make sure not to lose the corner. I want the viewer to be able to delineate where that corner is. I'm going to go forward just slowly so you can see that build up. Building up the shadow under the eaves again, bringing down a little bit of that darkness to kind of indicate those weathered boards. Darken that very back corner. I'm sorry, I think I clicked on the wrong thing and it backed us up. So now I'm going to build the silo in pretty much the same way. Again, I'm going to have it be quite cool. I will let a little bit of the browns show a little more at the top than at the bottom. And one of the things I want to bring up before I forget is because of the horizon line of your piece, that will change how a rounded object looks. So the horizon line is basically, we could think of it as the eye level. For us in this piece, our eye level is really almost right at that bottom edge, the bottom line of the left side of the barn roof. So all of the rounded shapes of the silo underneath of that edge will be a smiley face curve. It will curve up. All of the rounded shapes above the roof will be a frowny face. They'll curve down. And you can see that a little bit in the, if you're using the wood cutouts, you'll see that a little bit in the engraved marks that are on the wood pieces. But as you're painting, if you can just focus, just kind of concentrate on those bottom brush strokes being a smiley face, and the top brushstrokes being a sort of a frown face. Not too dramatic, just a little bit of a curve downward. And those kinds of things are really fun to study if you're um, ever looking at still lifes or reference photos that you're considering using. All of those all of those little details can really help us tell the viewer what a shape of something is and where the vantage point is. I want to give the roof of the silo a little bit of a metal feel, so I'm letting it purposefully get more blue. I want the whole silo to have a metal feel, but the top will just it is usually just a little bit more pronounced, a little shinier. So I'm going to come forward just a little bit. You can see me adding some burnt siennas here, trying to give a little bit of a rusty feel. So I touched in with the burnt sienna and then used my finger to soften it, kind of press it in. This piece is so big, it's very difficult to paint it on camera. I'm sorry, my hand is a little bit in the way. So you can see I have the bluer shade of paint on the left, the darker on the right. Now I've mixed a lighter color to go in between, and I'm just pulling it horizontally between those two colors, not necessarily blending, but just pulling them together a little bit. And just like we talked about on the barn with the vertical brush strokes, on the silo, I really want to have mostly horizontal brush strokes to give, again, that feel of the metal bending around that shape. Go forward a little bit more. There, I'm just letting some of the variation of some darks come through. And now we'll start on the roof. The same basic plan of attack here. Again, I want it to have a metal feel, so I'm going to be adding in a little bit of a feel of some rusty areas, some brown areas. Even though this is the cooler side, the rusty areas will have a brown look. So watch the brush strokes here too. Now our brush strokes, the top section of the barn angles a little bit less steeply than the bottom part. So make sure with your brush strokes that you're following those angles. And you do have to be pretty loose. My brush here is a little bit small. I could have used a bigger brush, but the nice thing about the small brush is that you do get more streaks and lines, and I kind of did want that. So experiment with different sizes. Again, I know I say this a lot, but I'm never in a hurry when I paint. I feel like I'm in a hurry with a lot of other things that I do. I don't like to hurry when I'm painting. So I'm never worried if I'm using a smaller brush and it's taking a little bit longer. See me darkening right there a little bit, just trying to indicate that the difference of that angle of that roof part. So I'm gonna come forward slowly. You can see there I've added in a little bit of green. I liked how that looked. If it's a metal roof, then it would have potentially some reflections of trees that are around it, even fields and grasses that are around it. So um, I liked that green there. So of course we can mix our greens with any of the blues that you have on your palette. And I think cad yellow is what I have. Yeah, the cad yellow here. Really manage the amount of paint on your brush as you go in to try to pull some of these colors together. Pinch off your brush, run the brush along the different colors. If you have too much paint on your brush when you go in to try to pull the colors together, it just kind of muddies it all up. You don't end up with the same definition of the pretty colors that you have in there. But of course, if you go in with a brush to pull them together and you get rid of too many of the greens or too many of the browns, just put them back in. So at this point now, all of the paint is dry. And I'm going to come back in and start to add in some of the highlights of the barn boards. So I'm mixing titanium white. This is the warm side, so I'm adding in a little bit of burnt sienna. And you can see how I'm using my brush. This is again the Filbert brush. I'm using the brush very laid down, very almost flat against my substrate. And I'm holding it very lightly and I'm just dragging the brush. So in essence, I'm using the brush the very same way that you would use a palette knife. So with no pressure, just drag the brush, let the paint skip over the surface of the substrate. Um, this technique is one of the reasons why I like to use the heavy body paint. We don't want our paint to be thinned out here. The thicker the paint is, the better it will skip and drag along the surface. I'm wiping my brush a lot as I come through here. Vary the colors. Sometimes I'm adding in a little bit more of the burnt sienna. Sometimes I'm leaving it a bit more true white. And I hope that you could see just there as I'm loading the brush on my palette, I'm kind of scooping it up the very same way that you would with a palette knife. So I pull out a bit of paint, and then I pick up paint on the edge of my brush. It makes sort of a bead of paint on the edge of your brush. It also helps when you're doing this, experiment with your the pressure that you're using, but you can sort of pick out that I'm also rocking the brush back and forth a little bit. So I'm letting it catch more in different areas. You can see I varied the color there again a little bit. And now I'm coming back with a clean brush and um, settling in some of those areas. I'm trying to leave some of the texture, trying to leave some of those variations in the stroke, but just refining it just a little bit. You can see I've changed my brush, the way that I'm holding it a little bit, um, making more of a brush stroke rather than the sort of palette knife stroke. So I'm combining both of those kinds of brush strokes to get the look that I'm going for. I'm coming back in with a basically clean brush. I'm going to pull in that area a little bit at the top so it doesn't look quite such a strong edge on the paint strokes there. You can see already how much better that looked after just adding in a few paint strokes. Evidently, someone is working on my neighbor's yard, so my dogs are gonna hear the machines outside the window. Higgins, no. No, lay down. Do you guys have one of your dogs that just loves to bark? That's Higgins. Holly is just like unfazed, but Higgins loves to bark at everything. So again, this is a clean, basically dry brush. Um, I'm just coming in. So I call it sort of settling some of the areas in. And another interesting thing is that the paint had been on on my substrate for a little while, so it had had a little bit of time to start to tack up. So when I come back and run my brush over it, because it has started to dry a little bit, I retain some of that texture and interest that I had in the brush strokes before, but I can just settle it down a little bit. Um, so if you touch into your paint and you feel like it's making too much of a difference, use a blow dryer and blow dry a little bit across it just to start to tack it up, or wait a couple of more minutes and then come back and try it. So now I'm using that same technique and coming in to add a couple of darker shadowy areas. So you can go back and forth with this technique as many times as it takes to get the look that you're going for. I will say, as you're first trying this out, well, as you're first trying out this technique, try it on a piece of paper or in a sketchbook just to get the feel for how to load your brush. Um, but as you're adding in this kind of textured paint strokes, um, even though we want to build up some texture, don't let the paint get super thick super quick. Sneak up on it a little bit. Um, Try it with not too much paint on your brush. Make some strokes. When you feel like you've got it locked in, then you can dive in more with even more texture. But go slow, take baby steps, and make small changes as you start to feel for the look you're going for. I'm going to go forward just a little bit. I'm going to be doing the same exact technique on this lower edge and on the little milk shed to the right. I'm always looking. You can see there that I started down on the lower part of the barn, and then I went ahead and went up and added a few more lighter strokes up above. So follow your gut and you, do what you think catches your eye, what you feel like you need to do. I guess I bring that up because I'm it's it's trying to think of how to word it. It's good to always be letting your eye see the rest of your painting too. So it's easy when you're painting to get really focused on, I'm just looking at this area around this big barn door. Try to make yourself always be assessing everything else that's going on too. Look at the other areas and see how the paint that you're putting on now is affecting the overall picture. I hope that made sense. It really is. Painting is as much a skill of teaching your eye how to see things as it is teaching your hand how to use the brush. I think probably the skill in painting comes more in what your eye is seeing than what your hand is doing. Oh, that was my stomach growling. Is it lunchtime? I want to back up just a little bit there so you could see see what I'm doing. So I've added in some of those strokes, and now I'm coming back in with a clean brush and almost using it like an eraser, holding it on the chisel edge and pulling up some of the paint that I just put down. So by pulling up some of that paint, I'm showing that color underneath and adding into that weathered board effect that I'm going for. So we can use our brush to paint, and we can use our brush to sort of unpaint. Let's go forward just slowly as I build this. It's the exact same steps. Adding in some light, come back in and add some darks if you feel like you need to. You saw me add some lights to that horizontal board. So I'm letting my brush strokes change with the direction of that board. Same steps exactly on that little milk barn to the side. Even though in this piece, the flowers are really what our focal point can be, since they're so forward and they're going to have glass and resin on them. This front part of the barn is the barn focal point. So you could see me there take a lot less time on the little milk shed to the right and kind of smooth those strokes out a bit more because I want more of the interest to be in the texture in the front of the barn. Now I'm going to be adding the same type of brush strokes to this left side of the barn, but you can see that these are already bluer because again, this is the cooler side and I want to really make sure to capture that shaded side of the barn. I don't know if you could see me there. As I was pulling in those paint strokes, I turned the brush over to use the paint on the other side, but then I also held the brush on the vertical. So it's using sort of the thinner edge of that filbert. So it made really some interesting brush strokes. So as you're painting, rock your brush and turn your brush and do different things with it. It's such a light pressure. There's almost no pressure in my fingertips on the brush when I'm pulling it across like that. In fact, I often hold my brushes very loosely. In a lot of the films that I do in recording my paintings, I drop my brush a lot. And I used to always wonder, like, why can't I keep a hold of the brush? But I like it because I can have a light touch. Um, I'm not squeezing the brush, and by having that lighter touch, you can make some lighter strokes. Every now and then, it's nice in some areas to really press down, but a lot of times we want that more finessed brush stroke. You could see me pinch out the brush there. I felt like I was taking out too much of the shadow, so I needed to get some of that white out of the brush. Go forward just slowly. Here, I'm using the palette knife to give just a little bit of an indication of maybe a board around the windows. So I'm not spending a lot of time on it. I'm just loading the edge of the back of the palette knife with a little bit of that bluer gray color and just dragging it along the edges of those window frames. See how I'm holding the palette knife with just my thumb and the tips of my fingers? It's very, very light and very loose. Go forward just a little bit. I do that on all the windows. I do it a little bit on the door area, and then you could see me there just pulling the palette knife through the paint, um, kind of scratching in some of the board shapes. And this is where, because I have used some open medium on the paints that are on my palette, and because I'm using some of the extender in my paint, that paint is staying somewhat wet. So if you are not using mediums like that and you find that you can't scratch in, your paint is already dry, you can add in the same types of vertical um, the feeling of the vertical boards with the palette knife and some of your darker burnt sienna, blue, gray mixture. Go forward a little bit, still just working on the windows, just a little bit. Use the palette knife on a little bit of the edges of the roof. The thing that I love about the palette knife is that you get some of those skips and the irregular application of the paint. If I used a brush, I would have a much more solid line of paint there, and I'm really looking for that variation, the highs and lows of the paint picking up. So I used a little bit of the palette knife um, to also add in just a couple of highlights along the front of the barn. You can see right under my thumb there where there's just a little bit of a more highlighted area. I always have my fingers in the paint too. Sometimes the fingers are the best tool. So now I'm going to come in and start to add some of the texture to the roof. Because this is the cool side, I'm using that same bluer gray. And in some of these areas, I'm going to press down on the palette knife much more than I did before. So again, experiment with what works and what gives you the look that you're looking for. So I'm kind of shaking it and pressing it to give some of those interesting marks that you can get with a palette knife. You can see me there thinking, where do I want to go it's easy to start having fun with the palette knife and let it get out of control. So you could almost see me there saying to myself, don't cover up all of the good stuff that you've already done. And it doesn't just have to be highlights. If you do get, you know, go crazy and forget what you're doing, you can always come back and add in some of those dark areas again. If you haven't painted with a palette knife, I hope that you'll try it. Um, it really is fun to do. But experiment with the different things, experiment with a light touch, just skipping it over the surface, experiment with more pressing the flat of it down, onto the piece. You see me wiggling it across there? I'm really trying to get some of those textures. I love how that last stroke went through. So even though I'm taking my finger back in to settle it in a little bit, I'm trying not to get rid of all of that interesting stuff that just happened. I'm gonna go forward a little bit and putting some highlights right on that ridge. I'm coming in and doing the same thing with the silo. I want to be a little bit more careful over here. I want the silo to have a bit more of a smooth feel. So I don't want to let the palette knife get too out of control over here. But again, I'm thinking about the frown at the top and the smile at the bottom. Adding in some blue again to give it a little bit of the feel of the metal. Um, I felt like it got a little bit too blue, so you see me going both ways across it to pull it into the white a little bit more. The only problem with using your finger is that you have to make sure that you've wiped off your finger before you touch it again. Otherwise, you end up dragging the last color you touched into everything. So I just picked up a little bit more of the gray color. Higgins, no. You can see how working back and forth between adding in some of the lighter grays, then adding in this kind of a browner gray. all of those layers of color are just so interesting and really make such a big impact when you see the piece. I keep looking back at the painting behind me to see it's so interesting to watch myself repaint this, um, because I really want that little, edge between the barn at that back left corner and the silo. I wanna make sure that there's enough of a shadow there, and that shadow is going to help press it back a little bit and give the indication that the barn is in front. So add some highlights to the roof. I I'm looking for that shine across the metal of the the metal of the roof. If one finger's dirty, use the other finger. Really nothing, nothing smooths the paint though, like a finger. It's one of my favorite things about painting is getting my fingers in it. So the last little bit is just adding a few more highlights to the barn. And with this piece, I really did spend a lot of time um, taking this piece up to my kitchen, putting it up on my counter, looking at it as I walked by it multiple times. It's one of my favorite things to do with my pieces. And having the pieces glued down at this point really is nice because it allowed me to be able to pick it up, carry it around, place it in different rooms, and see how I felt about it. Um, I I will say that one of the things that kept nagging at me as I was looking at it was the worry that there was too much texture in the barn, that the barn was almost um, too busy with the weathered wood look. So if you're at this stage with your painting and you're feeling that way, um, please wait. Please don't make too much of a decision until you get the flowers on the front because you really can't get a real feel for how much you want going on in the barn until you have that um, until you have all those other pieces in place. So I'm just coming in and ramping up the highlights a little bit more. I'm being very mindful not to cover everything that I've done before, but just make things lighter where I feel like they need to be. Higgins, no. So I set that little bit of white in with the palette knife, and then I just use a flicking motion with the filbert brush just to soften that top edge up into the paint that was above it. Higgins. He's just been annoying this live for some reason. I wanted to let some of this palette knife work just play so you can see it. Um, I know there's a lot of it, but you know, hopefully if it's here for you, you can play it and get a good feel for what I'm doing. You can certainly, if you're rewatching this on the video, fast forward through some of this. I just want to make sure that I give you as much information as I can. You have seen me a couple of times dip into the extender with the palette knife. Um, at this point, I've got some of the texture underneath from the first go through with the palette knife. So thinning the paint a little bit will help me make just some more sort of subtle highlights. In other words, I'm trying not to add too much texture at this point, and I can control the texture by thinning the paint down. A thick paint is going to give me much more texture than a thinned down paint. I'm going to go forward just a little bit. Again, just going back and forth between the palette knife and the brush. I'm purposefully letting this little milk shed get not be quite as bright as the front of the barn. So again, that helps give the impression that maybe it's a little bit further set back than the front of the barn, but it also helps to bring the attention to the front of the barn where I want it. Adding a little bit more texture to the side. Now I've said it probably a zillion times, but I want to really make sure I keep this side cooler. I want to make sure that everything I do over here is more blue than the front. Adding in just a little bit more highlight and interest to the colors over on the silo. I don't want there to be a lot of texture here. I just want there to be lots of hits of lights to make it have that metal look. And because I want to manage the texture, using a brush to go back in gives the smoother look that I'm hoping for over here. And speaking of smoothness, now you can see my brush strokes be very long and sweepy. Those longer brush strokes pulling across the whole area will help give that smoothness too. And again, remember, smile at the bottom, frown at the top to give that rounded shape. I'm going to come in with a few more highlights. And now I'm just setting the flowers on just to get a feel for where they're going to cover up on the barn. Do I have the areas where the flowers are going to cover dark enough to make them look like they're in shadow? I'm gonna go, I wasn't sure if I skipped over too much of the, so basically what I've done here, I'm gonna make sure that I'm covering how to glue this together. So I'm just trying to glue in the spacers that are behind the pieces. So you can see the two circles here, that's a double high spacer because it has to go above the barn and it has to go above the two flower pieces that are on each side, on the left and on the right. I'm using the Starbond thick glue here. I don't use the accelerator because I do like for I like to have a little bit of the working time. So you can see I placed the spacers underneath of my piece to make sure that they weren't going to show once the flowers were in place. These are just single high spacers over here. And I'm just lifting up one corner and then putting a little bit of glue underneath to glue all of these down. When I'm placing my spacers, I'm trying to think about how to best support that piece underneath. So you can see I have quite a few spacers along the bottom. And then up at the top, I've just tried to make sure that the flowers are supported well enough. Those very top leaves that go up on the barn, they're supported there, so I don't have to worry about a spacer there. So I'm just double checking to make sure that none of the spacer shows. And when I pushed it there, I was just making sure that I had enough support back there. So now I'm going to come in on the tops of all of those spacers with some glue. Forgot to glue that one down. That flower that touches the barn, you could have put some glue on the back of that if you choose to. However, since I'm adding resin, I really am not worried about that area being glued down. Now I'm just using my fingers along the edge of the substrate on the bottom and on the side. And then I'm going to press, try to make sure that I have good contact on all of those spacers while not letting it slide at all. I want to make sure that that bottom left and the very bottom are flush. And I just need to hold it about 10 seconds, 15 seconds, just long enough to make sure that that it's gotten good contact and a good glue on those spacers. If you have something heavy in your studio, you could definitely set something on top of the piece. Like your dirty your dirty paint water. So the same thing with the spacers on the right. I've just placed them under, kind of eyeing where they're going to go. Make sure they're hidden underneath, and then glue the spacers down. I like this this order. I like gluing the spacers down to the substrate and then gluing the flowers on top. This is pretty much how I tackle every gluing that needs the spacers. I think it's just easier to manage the spacers and making sure they're hidden under the piece. So double checking, and then I'll glue the tops of those. So again, this is just a single high spacer. We only need it to be higher than the barn that the flowers overlap. So again, I'm going to make sure that I use my fingers to feel that it's flush against the right side and the very bottom, and then hold it to make sure that it has a good contact. So our last pieces again are the double high spacers. If you get quite a few of the wood cutouts, um, make yourself a little bowl of all of the little offcuts, the little extra cuts that are in your pieces, and save all of them. It sure is nice for a piece like this to have a few extra spacers just sitting around. I try to put plenty of spacers in for you guys, but just keeping them is nice. So these double high spacers, they are two thicknesses because we need this set of flowers to be above the barn that the other flowers are sitting on and above the other flowers. So they are two layers. That makes this middle set of flowers, in essence, 3 layers high in the dimension of the piece. Double checking those. And then again, adding glue to the very top of the spacers. So you could certainly add in more spacers. If you do ship your pieces, it's a good idea to double check that all of the edges of the flowers are well supported underneath. You don't want any of those pieces to break. I don't know that I would ever ship a piece this big, but it's just a good thing to keep in mind in this step as you're going forward. So double check on this one that you're level along the bottom, that it's flush along the bottom of your substrate. So we're going to start with the flowers just by bringing in some of the greens that are in the background of the flowers. So I'm still using that same Titan Buff, Cad Yellow, um, a little bit of the Cobalt Blue, and a touch of the Burnt Sienna just to mute it down a little bit. I'm just starting to lay in some of the greens that are that are in these leaves and the behind the flowers. And the detail of these wood cutouts, if you're using the wood cutouts, this whole process is going to be so much easier for you. We don't have to do a lot with any of these leaves because the detail and the shape is already built in for you. If you're not using the wood cutouts, I would have done the barn just like we did, and then put the tracer back on your piece and trace in the flowers to begin your painting here. I'm letting the tops of these where the green, the background greens are, I'm letting them be a little bit warmer so that this green has a little bit more burnt sienna. As we get down to the bottom, the areas that are really kind of in the depths of the flowers, we'll add a lot more of the blue to let it darken. So that is all for part 2. I will be back to teach exactly how I paint the flowers. As you can see from the piece behind me, I went with sort of a white, light purple flower, and then the dark purples. I wanted my piece to have a little bit more of a spring feel to it, so I liked these this kind of purple kind of pastel colors. This piece would be beautiful done in reds and oranges, would give a little bit more of a summertime feel maybe. But I hope you enjoyed this part. If you have any questions, you know that you can always post here. You can ask a question or message me on Patreon. And of course, you can come into the Facebook group and ask any questions there. Of course, always feel free to post a progress picture of what you're doing. I'm happy to give feedback and a few little tips along the way that hopefully will help. So I'll see you in the next video for painting the flowers.